Let's dive right into this explainer, where we're going to unlock the true power of Annex A.1 in ISO 14001-2026 and see how it completely transforms the way we audit. If you evaluate environmental management systems, you already know that interpreting the standard can sometimes feel like trying to read a map without a compass. You're staring at a rigid clause, your client is staring back at you, and you're both wondering what a vague word like appropriate actually means in their highly specific context. Well, today we're focusing on how this non-mandatory interpretive guidance helps lead auditors grasp the intent and conceptual boundaries of the standard, all without creating the single new auditable requirement.
Let's quickly run through our roadmap. We're going to start with the checklist auditing trap, introduce Annex A.1, clarify that it provides guidance rather than new rules, look at setting conceptual boundaries, resolve some of that clause ambiguity, and finally, wrap up with how we achieve perfectly consistent audit outcomes.
Section 1. The Checklist Auditing Trap. So here is the absolute crucial question every lead auditor needs to ask themselves when evaluating an environmental management system. Are you auditing for basic compliance, or are you auditing for true intent? As the source material makes clear, ISO 14001-2026 was never intended to function as a static compliance mechanism. It's supposed to be a dynamic management framework. But if we only look at the exact literal words on the page without grasping the spirit behind them, we risk missing the entire point of the standard, and we end up frustrating the very organizations we're trying to assess.
Think about a checklist wrapped in heavy chains. That rigid, locked-down mindset is the exact danger of checklist auditing. When we read clauses too literally, we strip away all the context and end up imposing rigid, inappropriate expectations. Sure, the standard requires organizations to determine conformity based on evidence, but evidence can only be evaluated correctly when the intent of the requirement is completely understood. Without understanding that intent, we might interpret requirements way too strictly, or even way too loosely, leading to wildly inconsistent findings. What we absolutely need is contextual auditing, where we apply professional, flexible judgment to real-world, messy implementations.
Section 2. Introducing Annex A.1.
So if capturing that intent is our main goal, Annex A.1 is literally your master key. It translates the what of those mandatory clauses into the why and the how. You see, the structure of ISO management system standards follows a highly deliberate architecture. The main clauses contain the strict, non-negotiable requirements that an organization has to meet. But Annex A.1 functions as a foundational interpretive reference. It steps back and explains the core purpose of the standard, the logic behind how different clauses interact, and the conceptual boundaries of the EMS as a whole.
Think of the main clauses as your rigid map, and Annex A.1 as the compass that actually guides you through a complex, ever-changing landscape. Because let's be real, environmental challenges differ wildly across sectors. Going from a tiny tech startup to a heavy manufacturing plant is a massive shift, and highly prescriptive instructions in the main clauses would just stifle innovation and be totally impossible to implement universally. Annex A.1 gives us those nuanced explanations that help everyone understand how those strict requirements can be applied proportionally, based entirely on an organization's unique context and risk exposure. Moving on to Section 3. Guidance, not new requirements. When we map out the core differences between the rules and the context, it becomes incredibly clear that while Annex A.1 provides crucial insights, it absolutely does not add any new rules to the game. In the main clauses, you'll constantly see the word shall, which indicates a mandatory, auditable requirement. But Annex A.1 is all about non-mandatory explanations and interpretive flexibility. As lead auditors, we have to fiercely distinguish between requirements that must be fulfilled and the guidance that informs how those requirements should be understood. Annex A.1 doesn't create a single additional obligation. It just acts as a lens to clarify how existing obligations should be viewed. I want to emphasize a really powerful takeaway directly from the source material. You can never, ever write up a nonconformity based on Annex A.1. A nonconformity represents a failure to fulfill a specific requirement, and Annex A.1 contains exactly 0 requirements. If an auditor writes a finding based on guidance text, it will almost certainly be successfully appealed and overturned. That said, this guidance text heavily influences how we interpret the sufficiency, adequacy, and effectiveness of the EMS when we're evaluating those main mandatory clauses.
By sticking strictly to the main clauses for our findings and using Annex A.1 purely for interpretation, we effectively prevent the dreaded trap of over-auditing. We've all seen it happen, right? Over-auditing occurs when well-meaning auditors start imposing their own personal expectations or industry biases way beyond the standard's actual requirements. This places massive, unnecessary burdens on organizations, and frankly, it undermines the credibility of the whole certification process. By anchoring your interpretations to Annex A.1, you maintain alignment with internationally agreed-upon guidelines and keep personal biases completely out of the audit.
Section 4. Setting conceptual boundaries.
Annex A.1 helps us navigate 4 specific boundaries to ensure we scale our expectations proportionally. First up, it tells us that environmental aspects should focus strictly on what the organization can actually control or influence rather than trying to boil the ocean. Second, it anchors our expectations to the organizational context, meaning local conditions and business realities absolutely matter. Third, it helps us interpret risk-based thinking, reminding us that risks aren't just about mitigating environmental harm, they are also about seizing opportunities for environmental benefit. And lastly, it clarifies leadership commitment, showing that it isn't just about a CEO signing a policy and hanging it on a wall, but demonstrating active, verifiable accountability in daily operations.
Let's look at proportionality in action. Common sense tells you that you wouldn't audit a small office building the exact same way you'd audit a massive industrial facility. Annex A.1 actually provides the formal framework for why that is. Not all environmental aspects require identical levels of control. A massive chemical plant has high-risk aspects like toxic emissions that demand robust, expensive engineering controls. Meanwhile, a small software consultancy might just have low-risk aspects like paper recycling, requiring much simpler monitoring mechanisms. Annex A.1 explicitly instructs auditors to interpret adequacy based on risk significance, rather than applying a lazy one-size-fits-all expectation.
Section 5. Resolving clause ambiguity. Whenever you come across famously flexible terms in the main clauses, words like appropriate or proportionate, Annex A.1 is your go-to resource for figuring out what they actually mean in the real world. The flexibility of ISO 14001:2016 is definitely its greatest strength, but it does introduce a lot of interpretation variability. When a clause says a process must be appropriate, how do you define that without just being entirely subjective? Annex A.1 enables us to interpret these vague expectations logically, evaluating them strictly against the organization's actual environmental aspects and risk exposure, rather than relying on our gut feelings or arguing endlessly with the client. To handle this kind of ambiguity, there's a highly effective 4-step mental process every auditor should use in the field. You can't just read a clause and jump straight to a conclusion. First, read the mandatory clause. Second, consult Annex A.1 to really understand the underlying intent behind that clause. Third, evaluate the organization's unique environmental context and risk profile. And only then, in step 4, do you form an evidence-based judgment. This methodical approach is what prevents us from incorrectly classifying a perfectly conforming but highly unique system as non-conformant. Finally, Section 6. Consistent audit outcomes.
The ultimate benefit of properly utilizing Annex A.1 is that it harmonizes audits, ensuring vital consistency across different auditors, certification bodies, and global industries. When auditors rely strictly on literal, isolated wording from the clauses, you inevitably get conflicting findings. This creates massive frustration for clients and erodes market confidence in EMS certification overall. But when everyone leverages Annex A.1 as a shared interpretive framework, subjective variability plummets. It ensures that an audit conducted at a logistics firm in Tokyo is evaluated on the exact same foundational principles as an agricultural firm in Toronto.
Having this shared framework means we can finally, confidently differentiate between a true non-conformity and an organization simply using a unique yet totally valid operational approach. Annex A.1 clarifies that the standard does not prescribe specific process designs. It simply requires effective environmental management outcomes. So, if an organization uses advanced digital dashboards instead of traditional paper records, Annex A.1 helps us recognize this as an innovative approach rather than a deviation. It truly empowers your professional judgment, focusing the audit on whether the organization is actually achieving its intended outcomes, rather than just ticking arbitrary boxes on a clipboard. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to consider before you step into your next audit engagement. The clauses give you the hard rules, yes, but Annex A.1 gives you the vision to see how those rules actually fit into the real world. So ask yourself, are you just acting as a document verification machine, or are you truly evaluating environmental management effectiveness? Will you let rigid clauses limit your perspective, or will you let Annex A.1 guide your professional judgment? The choice, and the ultimate value of your audit, is entirely up to you.